Sometimes the things we regret most are the family we never got to know. Sometimes the past comes looking for us when we least expect it. Silas Boone was the richest cowboy in Texas, but his horse kept acting strange. Every evening, his mare, Ember, pulled him toward an old cave he hadn't visited in 30 years. When he finally followed her inside, he found a letter from his dead brother hidden behind some old crates. The letter talked about a secret that would change everything, a child nobody knew existed. Now this wealthy rancher had to face a truth that all his money couldn't fix. He had family out there somewhere, and time was running out to make things right. But would finding this hidden relative bring healing to his lonely heart, or would it destroy everything he'd built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Boone Ranch as Silas stood on his wraparound porch, coffee steaming in his weathered hands. 43 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his blue eyes, he surveyed an empire that stretched farther than most men could ride in a week. 10,000 head of cattle grazed on his land, silver mines dotted his northern properties, and his name carried weight from San Antonio clear to El Paso. But wealth had a way of making a man's world feel smaller, not larger. His housekeeper, Rosa Martinez, emerged from the kitchen, carrying a plate of eggs and biscuits. At 62, she'd been with the Boone family longer than anyone else still breathing, having served his father before the old man passed 5 years ago. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her brown eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from watching generations grow and fade. "You're up early again, Señor Silas," she said, setting the plate on the small table beside his rocking chair. "Third time this week." Silas nodded toward the pasture where Ember stood apart from the other horses, her chestnut coat gleaming in the dawn light. "Something's got into that mare. Can't shake the feeling she's trying to tell me something." Rosa followed his gaze. She'd noticed it too, how Ember would pace the fence line every evening, always facing toward Black Mesa. "Animals know things we don't, Mijo. My grandmother used to say horses could see into places the living couldn't reach." The comment settled uneasily in Silas's chest. He'd been having dreams lately, fragmented images of his brother Marcus that left him restless and aching. Marcus had been gone 15 years now, killed at Antietam when they were both young men full of fire and certainty. The war had taken a lot of good men, but losing Marcus had carved something out of Silas that never quite healed. "Rosa," he said quietly, "do you ever think about the paths we don't take?" She studied his face with maternal concern. "Every day, Mijo, but dwelling on what's gone won't bring it back." Footsteps on the wooden porch announced the arrival of Jake Morrison, Silas's ranch foreman. Tall and lean with a mustache that had gone completely white, Jake had been riding with Silas for over a decade. He removed his hat and wiped his brow with a faded bandana. "Morning, boss. Got those numbers you wanted on the south pasture?" Jake's expression was serious. "We're going to need to move that herd closer to water. Creek's running lower than I've seen it." Silas nodded, his mind only half on ranch business. "Do what you think best, Jake. You know this land as well as I do." Jake shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't like Silas to be so distracted. "You feeling all right, boss? You've seemed, I don't know, distant lately." Before Silas could answer, the sound of a horse and buggy approaching drew their attention. Bank President Charles Williams climbed down from his carriage, his round face flushed from the morning heat. Williams was a soft man who'd grown wealthy on other people's money, but he was honest in his dealings, which made him valuable in a territory where handshake agreements still meant something. "Silas, good to see you," Williams called out, mopping his face with a silk handkerchief. "I hope you don't mind the early visit, but I have some news that couldn't wait." Silas gestured to an empty chair. "Coffee, please." Williams settled his considerable bulk into the chair with a grateful sigh. "There's been talk in town about your brother's old property up near Amarillo. Seems someone's been asking questions about the deed." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Marcus's small ranch had been abandoned since his death, too remote and rocky to be worth much. Silas had kept paying the taxes out of sentiment, but no one had shown interest in it for years. "What kind of questions?" Silas asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Legal questions. About inheritance, next of kin. Fellow named Peterson claims to be a lawyer from back east. Didn't get much more than that before he moved on." Rosa had gone very still beside them. She'd been there during those terrible months after Marcus's death, when Silas had drunk himself half to death, trying to forget the guilt that ate at him. The brothers had fought bitterly before Marcus left for the war, harsh words about duty and family that could never be taken back. "When was this?" Silas asked. 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. Thought you should know." 2 weeks. Right around the time Ember had started acting strange. After Williams left, Silas found himself alone on the porch with his thoughts and the weight of a silver pocket watch in his vest pocket. It had been their father's watch, passed down through 3 generations of Boone men. Marcus should have inherited it as the older brother, but he'd left it behind when he rode off to war, saying he didn't want anything holding him to the past. Silas pulled out the watch and flipped it open. Inside the cover, their father had engraved both their names, Marcus and Silas Boone, brothers always. The inscription felt like mockery now. They died brothers in name only, separated by pride and words that cut too deep to heal. The afternoon heat was brutal as Silas rode through his properties, checking on cattle and water sources, but his mind kept wandering. The vast landscape that usually brought him peace felt empty today, all the space in the world, unable to fill the hollow places in his heart. He'd built this empire partly to prove himself to a father who'd favored Marcus, and partly to bury the guilt of surviving when his brother didn't. Every acre, every head of cattle, every silver nugget pulled from his mines was another layer between him and the memory of their last conversation. "You think money makes you better than the rest of us," Marcus had shouted that final night. "But when the shooting starts, all that silver won't stop a bullet." "And what will?" Silas had shot back. "Your noble ideals? Your grand speeches about duty? At least I'll die, knowing I stood for something." Those had been the last words they'd spoken to each other. Marcus rode out the next morning without a goodbye, and 3 months later, a letter arrived informing Silas that his brother had died charging Confederate lines at Sharpsburg Creek. As the sun began to set, Silas found himself near the pasture where Ember was kept. The mare immediately approached the fence, nickering softly and tossing her head toward Black Mesa. The mountain loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette, familiar yet somehow ominous. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, stroking her neck. "What do you see out there?" Black Mesa had been a hideout for outlaws and drifters for as long as anyone could remember. As young men, Silas and Marcus had explored its caves and hidden canyons, sometimes camping there when they wanted to escape their father's stern expectations. It was where they'd shared their biggest dreams and deepest fears, back when the future seemed limitless and brotherhood was an unbreakable bond. The cave Ember kept pointing toward held particular significance. It was where they'd hidden supplies during their wilder days, when they'd run with a group of men who lived outside the law. Nothing too serious, cattle rustling mostly, and the occasional stagecoach robbery. But they'd been young and reckless, and the cave had served as their secret storehouse. Silas hadn't been back there in decades. After Marcus died, the place held too many ghosts. But now, with the lawyer asking questions and Ember's strange behavior, the past was demanding his attention. The rational part of his mind insisted there was nothing in that cave but old memories and perhaps some rotting supplies. But horses were sensitive creatures, attuned to things humans missed. That night, he sat in his study surrounded by ledgers and land deeds. The trappings of his success spread before him like a king's treasure. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the grandfather clock in the corner marked time with steady, relentless precision. Rosa knocked and entered with a tray of coffee and cake. "You're thinking about him again," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas looked up from the papers he'd been staring at without reading. "How do you know?" "You get the same look you had after the funeral, like you're carrying a weight that's too heavy but you won't put it down." She was right. The guilt had never left him, only buried itself deeper under years and success. He'd convinced himself that building this empire was enough, that prosperity could balance the scales of brotherhood lost. But prosperity was cold comfort on nights when the wind howled across the plains, and he remembered what it felt like to have someone who understood him completely. "Rosa, do you think the dead can forgive the living?" She set down the tray and studied his face with concern. "The dead don't need our forgiveness, Mijo. They're at peace. It's the living who need to forgive themselves. And what if forgiveness isn't possible? What if some things cut too deep? Then maybe the dead try to help us find another way to heal." After Rosa left, Silas walked to the window and stared out at Black Mesa, barely visible under the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, in a cave he'd sworn never to visit again, lay whatever was calling to Ember. And perhaps, just perhaps, a chance to understand why a lawyer was asking questions about his dead brother's property. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily in the darkness, marking moments that would never come again, carrying the weight of two names that should have meant forever, but instead meant nothing but regret. The next evening, Silas could no longer ignore what Ember was telling him. The mare had spent the entire day pacing, whinnying toward Black Mesa with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Even Jake had noticed, commenting that something had spooked her, something fierce. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Silas made his decision. He saddled Ember, noting how she practically vibrated with anticipation as he tightened the cinch. The moment he mounted, she was off like a shot, heading straight for the mesa without any guidance from him. The ride took 40 minutes across rough terrain, through scrub brush and rocky washes that would challenge most horses. But Ember picked her way through the obstacles with supernatural confidence, as if she'd made this journey 100 times before. Silas found himself gripping the reins tighter than necessary, his heart hammering against his ribs. Black Mesa rose before them like a sleeping giant, its weathered face scarred with canyons and cave mouths that had sheltered outlaws and hermits for generations. Ember headed directly for a particular opening about halfway up the eastern slope, the same cave where he and Marcus had stored their ill-gotten gains during their youth. The cave mouth yawned before them, dark and unwelcoming. Silas dismounted and lit a kerosene lantern he'd brought, the flame casting dancing shadows that made the entrance look like the maw of some ancient beast. Ember stamped impatiently, tossing her head toward the opening. "All right, girl," Silas murmured. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." The cave stretched deeper than he remembered, the ceiling high enough for a man to walk upright. His footsteps echoed off the walls, and the air smelled of dust and time and something else, something that reminded him of old leather and gun oil. As he moved deeper, the lantern light revealed familiar landmarks, a natural shelf where they'd stored ammunition, a fire ring they'd used for cooking, the remains of old bedrolls. Everything was exactly as they'd left it 30 years ago, preserved by the dry air like artifacts in a tomb. But Ember hadn't led him here for nostalgia. She was focused on something specific, something that drew her like a magnet. Silas followed her gaze to a section of the cave wall where wooden crates were stacked against the stone. These weren't part of his memories. Someone had been here more recently. Approaching the crates, he saw they bore shipping marks from back east, dated just 5 years ago. His blood ran cold. 5 years ago was when his father had died, when Silas had been too consumed with grief and guilt to pay attention to much of anything else. Behind the largest crate, wedged between the wood and the cave wall, something caught the lantern's light. Paper, yellowed with age, but not as old as the cave's other secrets. Silas reached for it with trembling fingers, his breath catching when he recognized the handwriting. Marcus, his brother's careful script, still legible after all these years. The letter was addressed to him, Silas Boone, Boone Ranch, Texas. But the postmark showed it had never been mailed. Instead, someone had brought it here, hidden it away like a message in a bottle cast upon an endless sea. Silas sank onto one of the crates, his legs suddenly unsteady. The letter felt heavy in his hands, weighted with possibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But Ember had brought him here for a reason, and he owed it to them, both to himself and his brother, to read whatever Marcus had left behind. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, and Marcus's voice seemed to whisper from the past. Silas, if you're reading this, then I'm likely dead, and you've finally found your way back to the places we used to share. I pray that time has softened the anger between us, because what I have to tell you changes everything we thought we knew about family and duty. I have a daughter. Her name is Sarah, and she's 3 years old now, with eyes the color of spring grass and hair that catches sunlight like spun gold. Her mother was Elizabeth Hartwell, a schoolteacher I met in Amarillo before the war called me away. We were married in secret, intending to make it right when I returned. But as you know, I never did return. Elizabeth died in childbirth with our second child, a boy who lived only 3 days. Sarah survived, but she's been placed with strangers in St. Louis, people who don't know her blood or understand where she comes from. The lawyer handling the arrangements is named James Peterson. He's been instructed to find family if any exists, but I was too proud to list you as next of kin before I left for war. Silas, I know we parted with harsh words, but blood is thicker than pride. If something happens to me, Sarah is all that remains of our line. She deserves to know where she comes from, deserves to understand that Boone blood runs in her veins and that her people built something lasting in this wild country. I've left what money I had with Peterson, along with the deed to my property. It's not much, but it's honest work that might provide for a little girl who never asked to be alone in this world. The silver mine I found last year turned out richer than I expected, rich enough to give her a future if someone's willing to claim her as family. Brother, I hope your anger toward me has faded enough to see past old grudges. Sarah doesn't know about any of this yet. She's too young to understand that her papa won't be coming home. But someday she'll ask questions about her family, about where she belongs. I hope when that day comes, you'll be there to give her answers. If you're reading this, then Peterson has likely been asking questions. Don't let him leave empty-handed. Don't let our blood disappear into the anonymity of city orphanages and strangers' names. Sarah is your niece, your brother's daughter, the only piece of Marcus Boone that will outlive the war. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after the words we spoke, but I'm asking anyway, because she's innocent of our failures and deserves better than the loneliness we chose for ourselves. Find her, Silas. Give her the family I never could. Your brother always, Marcus. P.S. The watch should go to her when she's old enough. Father would have wanted it to stay in the family. The letter slipped from Silas's nerveless fingers as the full weight of revelation crashed over him. A niece. Marcus had died, leaving behind a daughter, and for 15 years she'd been growing up among strangers while Silas built his empire in ignorance. The lawyer, Peterson, had been looking for family because Sarah was now 18, old enough to claim her inheritance. The property Marcus had mentioned, the silver mine, all of it waiting for someone to step forward and acknowledge the blood connection. Ember snorted softly, as if satisfied that her mission was complete. She'd led him here to discover not just a letter, but the knowledge that he wasn't alone in the world. Somewhere in St. Louis lived a young woman who carried Boone blood, who had every right to know about the ranch and the family and the legacy her father had died protecting. But along with that knowledge came a crushing weight of responsibility. For 15 years, Sarah had lived without family while he'd mourned his solitude. 15 years of birthdays and holidays and growing up that he'd missed because he'd been too consumed with guilt to imagine that Marcus might have left something beautiful behind. The cave fell silent, except for the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the soft sound of Ember's breathing. The crates around him suddenly made sense. They contained Marcus's belongings, stored here by someone who knew the significance of this place. Peterson, perhaps, or Elizabeth's family, keeping Marcus's legacy safe until a relative could be found. Silas picked up the letter again, reading it twice more by lantern light. Each word carved itself deeper into his conscience, transforming his understanding of the past 15 years. He'd thought himself alone, thought the Boone line ended with him. But Marcus had managed to create something lasting, after all not in silver or cattle or land, but in a daughter who deserved to know where she came from. As he folded the letter carefully and placed it in his vest pocket next to the silver watch, Silas felt something shift inside him. The guilt that had driven him for so long transformed into something else, purpose. For the first time since Marcus's death, he had a mission that mattered more than profit or pride. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey to St. Louis to find his niece. Tonight, he would ride home and prepare for the most important task of his life, bringing family back where family belonged. Silas rode back to the ranch in darkness, his mind churning with possibilities and complications. The letter burned like a coal in his vest pocket, each word reshaping his understanding of the past and future. By the time he reached the house, lamps were glowing in the windows, and Rosa was waiting on the porch, worry etched across her weathered face. "Mijo, where have you been? I was starting to think something had happened." Silas dismounted slowly, his body aching from more than the long ride. "Rosa, we need to talk. There's something I need to tell you something about Marcus." She followed him into his study, where he poured himself a generous measure of whiskey before settling into his leather chair. The room felt different now, less like a monument to his success and more like a starting point for something entirely new. He pulled out the letter and handed it to Rosa without preamble. "Read this. Everything's about to change." Rosa's face transformed as she read, her eyes widening with each revelation. When she finished, she looked up at Silas with tears glistening in her eyes. Dios mío, a little girl. Marcus had a little girl. She pressed the letter to her chest. "She's not little anymore, is she? 18 years old, and we never knew. Her name is Sarah. Sarah Boone, though she's probably been raised with another name." Silas took a long pull of whiskey, feeling it burn away some of the tightness in his chest. "I have to go to St. Louis. I have to find her." "Of course you do." Rosa's voice was firm, filled with the same maternal authority she'd used when he was a boy, making excuses about shirked chores. "When do we leave?" "We? You think I'm going to let you meet your niece without a woman present?" "Aye. Men know nothing about these things. She's been living with strangers for 15 years, Silas. She's going to need gentle handling, not some rough cowboy storming into her life, demanding she come home." Silas smiled for the first time in days. Rosa was right, of course. He knew cattle and silver mines and business, but he knew nothing about young women or how to navigate the delicate work of rebuilding family connections. Having Rosa along would provide the maternal wisdom he lacked. The next morning brought a flurry of preparations. Jake took the news with characteristic stoicism, nodding gravely when Silas explained the situation. "Ranch'll be fine while you're gone, boss. Been running this place long enough to handle things. How long you figure to be away?" "Hard to say. Could be a week, could be a month. Depends on how things go with Sarah." Jake adjusted his hat, a gesture Silas recognized as his way of working through complex thoughts. "She might not want to come back with you, you know. 18 years is a long time. People put down roots, even when they don't mean to." The observation hit harder than Silas cared to admit. He'd spent so much time thinking about finding Sarah that he'd barely considered she might not want to be found. She'd grown up without knowing about the ranch or her father's family. For all he knew, she was happy with her life in St. Louis, settled with people she considered family. "Then I'll respect her choice," Silas said finally. "But she deserves to know where she comes from. She deserves to know Marcus wanted her to have family." Williams arrived that afternoon with the legal documents Silas had requested, papers transferring temporary authority over his business affairs to Jake and authorizing Rosa as his representative in family matters. The banker's excitement was barely contained. The story of Marcus's secret daughter had captured his imagination like a dime novel. "I've prepared letters of credit for the journey," Williams said, spreading papers across Silas's desk. "St. Louis banks will honor these, and I've included more than enough for extended accommodations. Finding someone after 15 years might take considerable time and resources." Silas studied the amounts Williams had authorized and whistled low. "This is enough to buy half the city. Your niece is inheriting considerable wealth, Silas. Marcus's silver mine turned out richer than anyone imagined. Peterson's been managing the claims, and they've generated substantial income over the years. Sarah Boone is already a wealthy young woman, even if she doesn't know it yet." The irony wasn't lost on Silas. He'd spent 15 years building an empire to fill the emptiness Marcus's death had left behind, only to discover that Marcus had left behind something far more valuable than silver, a daughter who'd inherited wealth of her own. That evening, as Rosa packed their belongings, Silas found himself drawn to Marcus's old room. He'd left it exactly as it was when his brother rode off to war, clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, books stacked on the bedside table, a half-finished letter on the writing desk that Marcus never got to send. On the dresser sat a small tin daguerreotype of their parents, taken when the brothers were boys. Silas picked it up, studying their father's stern face and their mother's gentle smile. Sarah had never seen this photograph, never known what her grandparents looked like. She'd grown up without family stories, without the shared history that connected people to their roots. Rosa appeared in the doorway, her traveling dress neat and practical. "The bags are packed, and I've arranged for Mrs. Henderson from town to help Jake with the cooking while we're gone. Are you ready for this?" "Me, Joe." Silas set down the daguerreotype and turned to face her. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for something like this. What if she doesn't want to know us? What if we're too late? Then we'll know we tried. But I think you're borrowing trouble that doesn't exist yet. Blood calls to blood, Silas. She's been living without family for 18 years. Don't you think she's wondered about where she came from?" The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect traveling weather. The train to St. Louis would leave from San Antonio, requiring a 2-day ride just to reach the station. Silas had arranged for a private car, partly for comfort, but mostly to ensure privacy for whatever difficult conversations lay ahead. As they prepared to leave, Ember approached the fence where Silas was saying his goodbyes. The mare seemed calmer now, as if her urgent mission had been completed. She nuzzled his hand gently, and for a moment Silas could swear he saw understanding in her dark eyes. "You did good, girl," he murmured, stroking her neck. "You brought me what I needed to find." Jake helped Rosa into the wagon, while Silas took a final look around his ranch. Everything he'd built, every acre and head of cattle, suddenly seemed less important than the journey ahead. For years, he'd measured success in dollars and land ownership, but none of it had filled the hollow spaces in his heart. Now he was chasing something different, not wealth or power, but connection, family, the chance to transform a lonely empire into something that mattered beyond his own lifetime. As the wagon rolled toward San Antonio, Silas touched the letter in his pocket and whispered a prayer to whatever forces had guided Ember to that cave. He was riding toward the unknown, carrying hopes and fears in equal measure, but for the first time in 15 years, he was moving toward something instead of running away from the past. The train journey to St. Louis stretched across 3 days of changing landscapes and restless thoughts. Silas sat in their private car watching Texas plains give way to Arkansas hills, then to Missouri valleys dotted with settlements that spoke of different lives, different possibilities. Rosa busied herself with needlework while occasionally offering observations about their fellow passengers or the towns they passed. "Look at all those people," she murmured, as they stopped at a bustling station. "Each one with their own stories, their own families. Makes you wonder how many other secrets are walking around, waiting to be discovered." Silas nodded, but his attention was focused on the telegram he'd received at the last station. Peterson, the lawyer, had responded to his wire with an address in St. Louis and a brief note. "Miss Hartwell resides at 1247 Magnolia Street with the Morrison family. Suggest discretion in initial contact." Miss Hartwell, not Miss Boone. After 18 years, Sarah still carried her mother's maiden name, probably never knowing her father's true identity. It was another reminder of how completely she'd been separated from her heritage. The train pulled into St. Louis Union Station on a grey October afternoon, the sky threatening rain and the air thick with smoke from countless chimneys. The city overwhelmed Silas with its noise and crowds, thousands of people hurrying about their business, streetcars clanging, vendors calling out their wares. After the open spaces of Texas, it felt like being pressed into a box. "Madre de Dios," Rosa breathed, clutching her carpet bag tighter. "How do people live with all this noise?" They took rooms at the Planters Hotel, a respectable establishment that provided the comfort befitting a man of Silas's wealth without drawing undue attention. The hotel clerk, a thin man with nervous eyes, recommended several restaurants and assured them that Magnolia Street was in a decent part of town, easily reached by streetcar. That evening, Silas stood at his hotel window, looking down at the gas-lit streets, trying to gather courage for what lay ahead. Somewhere in this maze of buildings lived his niece, probably unaware that her life was about to change forever. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical burden. Rosa knocked and entered without waiting for permission, carrying a tea service she'd somehow acquired from the hotel kitchen. "You're wearing a hole in that carpet with your pacing," she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Sit down and tell me what's eating at you." Silas accepted the cup gratefully, though his hands shook slightly as he lifted it to his lips. "What if we're making a terrible mistake, Rosa? What if bringing her back to Texas would ruin whatever life she's built here? And what if leaving her here means she never knows who she really is?" Rosa's voice was gentle but firm. "You can't protect people from their own heritage, Mijo. She has a right to know about Marcus, about the ranch, about the family that wants to claim her. But what if she's happy? What if the Morrisons have been good to her, raised her as their own? We could be destroying something beautiful." Rosa set down her tea and studied his face with maternal concern. "Silas, when did you become so afraid? The man I know doesn't hesitate when something needs doing." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the street below where people moved through pools of light cast by gas lamps. "I've been alone for so long, I'd forgotten what it feels like to have something that matters more than money. If she rejects us, if she wants nothing to do with the Boone name, I don't know how I'll bear it." "Then you'll bear it the same way you bore losing Marcus, one day at a time, until it stops hurting so much. But you'll bear it knowing you tried to do right by family." The next morning, they took a streetcar through the residential districts of St. Louis, past neat rows of brick houses with small gardens and painted shutters. The city was different in daylight, still busy, but somehow more manageable. Children played in the streets, while their mothers swept stoops and chatted with neighbors. Magnolia Street proved to be a tree-lined avenue where modest prosperity showed in well-maintained homes and the occasional carriage house. Number 1247 was a two-story brick house with white trim and a small front garden, already showing the brown edges of approaching winter. Smoke rose from the chimney and lace curtains hung in the windows. Silas and Rosa stood across the street, studying the house where Sarah had grown up. It looked like a place where people cared about appearances, where children were taught proper manners and the importance of education. The kind of home Marcus would have approved of for his daughter. "It's a good house," Rosa observed, Whoever took her in, they've done right by her. A figure moved past one of the upstairs windows, a young woman with long hair the color of sunlight. Silas's breath caught in his throat. Even from a distance, even through glass, he could see something familiar in her posture, something that reminded him powerfully of Marcus at that age. "That's her," he whispered. "That has to be her." As if she'd heard him, the young woman paused at the window and looked out toward the street. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the distance, and Silas felt a jolt of recognition that went deeper than sight. Family calling to family, blood recognizing blood. Then the moment passed. The young woman moved away from the window, and Silas was left standing on an unfamiliar street in an unfamiliar city, knowing that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict or control. "What now?" Rosa asked softly. "Now we do what we came here to do," Silas said, straightening his shoulders. "We introduce ourselves to our family." But even as he spoke the words, uncertainty gnawed at him. Sarah Hartwell, for that's how she'd think of herself, had built a life in this house, with these people, in this city. She had 18 years of memories that didn't include him, or the ranch, or anything to do with the Boone name. Was he being selfish, wanting to claim her as family, or was he finally doing something Marcus would have approved of? The only way to find out was to cross the street and knock on that door, carrying with him the hopes and fears of a man who'd spent too many years alone, hoping that family could bridge the gap between who they were and who they might become together. It took Silas 3 more days to work up the courage to approach the Morrison house. 3 days of walking past it at different hours, observing the rhythms of the household, trying to understand the life Sarah had built. He watched her leave each morning at 8 o'clock sharp, walking briskly toward the business district with a leather satchel under her arm. She dressed modestly but well, her movements confident and purposeful. "She works," Rosa observed from their bench in the small park across the street. "Not many young ladies from good families work, especially not with an inheritance waiting. Maybe she doesn't know about the inheritance yet. Peterson said he'd been looking for family if he only recently found us. She might not know about Marcus's money." On Thursday afternoon, they followed at a discreet distance as Sarah made her way to a small building that housed the St. Louis Female Seminary. Through the windows, they could see her teaching a classroom full of young children, her hands moving expressively as she explained some lesson at the blackboard. "A teacher," Silas murmured, pride mixing with surprise in his voice, "just like her mother." "Marcus would be proud," Rosa agreed. "She's made something of herself." That evening they finally approached Peterson's office. The lawyer was a thin, precise man in his 50s, with graying hair and spectacles that reflected the lamplight. His office was neat to the point of obsession, every paper in its proper place, every book aligned perfectly on the shelves. "Mr. Boone." Peterson rose from behind his desk, extending a cautious hand. "I must admit, I'd given up hope of finding Marcus's family. 15 years is a long time to maintain an estate without clear heirs." "Tell me about her," Silas said without preamble. "Tell me about Sarah." Peterson settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers. "She's a remarkable young woman, I must say. The Morrisons took her in when she was 3 good Methodist people who couldn't have children of their own. They've raised her as their daughter in every way that matters." "Does she know anything about her real parents?" "She knows her mother died in childbirth and that her father was killed in the war. The Morrisons told her his name was Marcus, but they never knew his surname. Elizabeth Hartwell took that secret to her grave, along with the knowledge of your brother's wealth." Rosa leaned forward. "How has she lived all these years?" "The Morrisons, are they wealthy people?" Peterson shook his head. "Thomas Morrison is a clerk at the railway office. They're respectable people, but not wealthy. Sarah has been teaching since she turned 16, contributing to the household expenses. She's quite independent, I'm told." The information painted a picture of a young woman who'd grown up with love but little material comfort, working to support the family that had taken her in. It explained why she walked to work instead of taking a carriage, why her clothes were well made but simple. "What about Marcus's estate?" Silas asked. "How much are we talking about?" Peterson pulled out a leather portfolio and spread several documents across his desk. "The silver mine has been quite productive. Combined with the land value and accumulated interest over 15 years, Miss Hartwell stands to inherit approximately $60,000. Rosa gasped. Silas felt his own breath catch. $60,000 was a fortune, more than enough to transform Sarah's life completely, to lift her from modest circumstances to considerable wealth. "She doesn't know," Peterson continued. "I've been instructed to locate family before revealing the inheritance. Marcus was quite specific that the money should go to family, not strangers, regardless of how kind they might be. And if we hadn't been found, the money would have reverted to her on her 21st birthday, family or no family. Marcus wasn't willing to let his daughter live in poverty indefinitely, but he hoped she'd have blood relatives to guide her." That night, Silas lay awake in his hotel bed, staring at the ceiling while street sounds drifted through the window. Everything he'd learned about Sarah made him prouder and more uncertain in equal measure. She'd grown up to be exactly the kind of person Marcus would have wanted: independent, caring, willing to work for what she needed. But that same independence might make her resistant to accepting help from an uncle she'd never known existed. The next morning brought an unexpected development. As Silas and Rosa sat in their usual spot across from the Morrison house, they saw Sarah emerge earlier than usual, but instead of heading toward the seminary, she walked directly toward their park bench. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor despite her upright posture. "I've noticed you watching our house for several days. I'm wondering if there's something I can help you with." Up close, the resemblance to Marcus was unmistakable. She had his green eyes and determined chin, his way of tilting her head slightly when asking a question. But there was something of their mother in her face too, a gentleness around the eyes that Marcus had always lacked. Rosa recovered first, rising from the bench with a warm smile. "My dear, we've been hoping for a chance to speak with you. My name is Rosa Martinez, and this is Silas Boone. We've traveled from Texas because we have something important to tell you, something about your father." Sarah's composure wavered slightly. "My father? But my father died in the war. The Morrisons told me." "Your father was Marcus Boone," Silas said gently, rising to stand beside Rosa. "He was my brother, which makes you my niece. We've come to bring you home." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge thrown down between them. Sarah's face went pale, her hands gripping the handle of her satchel until her knuckles showed white. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I don't have any family. I've never had any family except the Morrisons." "But you do," Rosa said softly. "You have an uncle who spent 15 years grieving for a brother he never got to reconcile with, and who's just discovered that he's not alone in the world after all." Sarah looked between them, her breathing quick and shallow. "I don't understand. Why now? Why come to me now after all these years?" Silas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the letter Marcus had written, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Because your father left this for me to find, and it took 18 years for the message to reach me. He wanted you to know where you came from, Sarah. He wanted you to know that you belong somewhere." Sarah stared at the letter in Silas's outstretched hand, as if it were a snake that might strike. Her green eyes, so like Marcus's, darted between his face and Rosa's, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate deception. "May I sit?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, Mija," Rosa said, making room on the bench. "This is a lot to take in." Sarah settled beside Rosa but kept her distance from Silas, her body tense with suspicion. "The Morrisons told me my father's name was Marcus, but they said he had no family, that he was alone in the world. If you're truly his brother, why didn't you come for me sooner?" The question cut Silas like a blade. "Because I didn't know you existed. Marcus and we parted on bad terms before he left for the war. We never reconciled, never spoke again. I thought he died alone, without leaving anything behind. What kind of bad terms? Sarah's voice carried a sharp edge that reminded him painfully of Marcus in an argument. Silas looked down at his hands, weathered from decades of ranch work, the kind that prideful young men create when they think being right matters more than being family. We fought about the war, about duty, about things that seem foolish now, but felt life and death important then. Sarah took the letter with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully, as if it might dissolve at her touch. As she read, her expression shifted from suspicion to wonder, to something approaching grief. When she finished, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "He knew about me," she whispered. "All this time, I thought the Morrisons always said my father never knew I existed, that he died before he could learn about me. But he knew. He wrote my name. He loved you," Rosa said gently. "Even though he never got to hold you, he loved you enough to make sure you'd have family if something happened to him. But something did happen to him, and I didn't have family. I had the Morrisons, who've been wonderful to me, but I grew up thinking I was completely alone in the world. Do you know what that feels like? 2Lee7, 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 2Lee7. Do you understand what it's like to look in mirrors and see a face that doesn't match anyone else's, to wonder where your eyes came from or why you laugh the way you do?" The pain in her voice was raw and immediate. Silas felt his own throat tighten with emotion he'd kept buried for years. "I do know, actually. I've spent 15 years thinking the same thing, looking around an empty house and wondering why I bothered building something that would die with me." Sarah studied his face with new intensity. "You really are alone too, aren't you? No wife, no children, just Rosa, who's been more family to me than I deserved. And now, if you'll have me, a niece who carries her father's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin." For the first time, Sarah's mouth curved in something approaching a smile. "The Morrisons always said I was too headstrong for my own good. Mr. Morrison calls it my contrary streak." "That's pure Boone blood," Rosa laughed. "Your uncle's the most contrary man in Texas when he sets his mind to something." The moment of levity broke some of the tension, but Sarah's expression grew serious again as she folded the letter. "You said you came to bring me home. Where exactly is home?" "Texas," Silas said. "A ranch bigger than this whole city, with cattle and horses and land that stretches to the horizon. It's where your father grew up, where your grandfather built something lasting. It's where you belong, if you want it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching a group of children play in the park while their mothers chatted on nearby benches. "I have a life here, Mr. Boone. I have students who depend on me, and the Morrisons have been my parents for 15 years. I can't just walk away from all of that because a stranger appears with a letter." "I'm not a stranger," Silas said quietly. "I'm family. There's a difference." "Is there? You've been family for 18 years, but this is the first time I've seen your face. How is that different from being a stranger?" The challenge stung because it was fair. Silas had no answer that didn't sound like an excuse or an accusation against circumstances beyond anyone's control. Rosa intervened with gentle wisdom. "Sarah, may I ask you something? In all these years with the Morrisons, have you ever felt like you truly belonged, like you were home?" Sarah's composure wavered. "They love me. They've given me everything they could." "That's not what I asked, Mija." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek. "No," she whispered. "I've always felt like I was visiting, like I was grateful to be allowed to stay, but never quite home." "That's because home isn't just a place where people are kind to you," Rosa said. "Home is where your blood runs in the ground, where your people built something for you to inherit. The Morrisons gave you love and care, and that's a precious gift. But they couldn't give you your heritage." "What if I don't want my heritage?" Sarah asked, her voice stronger now. "What if I like being Sarah Hartwell, the schoolteacher who takes care of herself? What if I don't want to be Sarah Boone, the rich rancher's niece?" Then that's your choice to make, Silas said, surprising himself with how much the words cost him. But you should make it knowing all your options. Peterson tells me your father left you a considerable inheritance, enough to change your life however you see fit. Sarah's eyes widened. Inheritance? What kind of inheritance? Silver mines, land, money that's been accumulating interest for 15 years. You're a wealthy woman, Sarah, whether you come to Texas or not. The information seemed to stagger her. She pressed her hands to her temples, overwhelmed by the magnitude of revelations. This morning I was a schoolteacher worried about paying for new winter boots. Now you're telling me I'm wealthy enough to buy the school. Money doesn't have to change who you are, Rosa said, but it does give you the freedom to choose who you want to become. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the park before turning back to face them. I need time to think. This changes everything. The Morrisons, my students, my entire life here. I can't just make a decision like this in one morning. Of course not, Silas said, rising as well. Take all the time you need. We'll be at the Planters Hotel when you're ready to talk more. As Sarah walked back toward the Morrison house, her steps uncertain and her shoulders bowed with the weight of impossible choices, Silas felt the first real doubt about his mission. He'd found his niece, but in finding her, he might be destroying the only life she'd ever known. 3 days passed without word from Sarah. Silas found himself walking the streets of St. Louis like a man possessed, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, trying to read signs that didn't exist. Rosa accompanied him on these aimless journeys, offering comfort when she could and wise silence when words wouldn't help. On the third afternoon, as they sat in the hotel lobby nursing coffee that had long grown cold, Peterson arrived with news that changed everything. There's been a development, the lawyer said, his face grave as he settled into a chair across from them. Sarah came to my office this morning with the Morrisons. They've been having family discussions about her inheritance, and some disturbing information has come to light. Silas felt his stomach drop. What kind of information? Peterson pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. It seems the Morrisons have been less than honest about their finances. Thomas Morrison has been embezzling from the railway office for the past 2 years. They're facing criminal charges and the very real possibility of prison time. Rosa gasped. Those poor people. And Sarah, does she know? She knows now. Morrison broke down and confessed everything yesterday evening. They're deeply in debt. He's likely to lose his position, and they've been using Sarah's teaching wages to make payments to creditors without telling her. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. The family that had raised Sarah, the people she'd been worried about leaving behind, had been deceiving her while taking advantage of her loyalty. How long has this been going on? The embezzlement started 2 years ago, but the financial troubles go back longer. Morrison's been gambling, making increasingly desperate bets to try to recover their losses. Sarah's inheritance couldn't have come to light at a more crucial time. What does this mean for Sarah? Silas asked. Peterson's expression was grim. It means the choice she thought she had to make between staying with the family she loves and accepting her inheritance has been made for her. The Morrisons will likely face criminal charges within the week. Even if they avoid prison, they'll certainly face financial ruin and public disgrace. Silas stood and began pacing the lobby, his mind racing. Everything he thought he understood about Sarah's situation had just been turned upside down. The stable, loving home he'd worried about disrupting was built on lies and stolen money. Where is Sarah now? Rosa asked. At the Morrison house, packing her belongings. Mrs. Morrison is beside herself with grief and shame. Mr. Morrison hasn't been able to look Sarah in the eye since he confessed. They've asked her to leave before the scandal breaks publicly. They're throwing her out? Silas's voice carried a dangerous edge. After 18 years, they're abandoning her when they need her most? It's more complex than that, Peterson said carefully. Morrison genuinely loves Sarah as a daughter, but he's also terrified that association with their family will damage her reputation and future prospects. In his mind, he's protecting her by sending her away. The irony was bitter. Sarah had spent days agonizing over whether to leave the people she considered family, only to discover that they'd been betraying her trust while forcing her to leave anyway. "We need to go to her," Rosa said, gathering her shawl. "She shouldn't be facing this alone." They found Sarah standing in the front garden of the Morrison house, a single carpetbag at her feet and tears streaming down her face. The woman Silas had first seen as composed and independent looked lost and broken, like a child whose entire world had crumbled in the space of a day. Mrs. Morrison stood in the doorway, her own face ravaged by grief and shame. She was a plain woman in her 50s, grey-haired and worn by years of worry that now made terrible sense. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Morrison called out, her voice cracking, "you don't have to go yet. We can find another way." "No, Mother." Sarah's voice was steady despite her tears. "Father was right. I can't stay here and watch you both suffer for something that's not my fault. It wouldn't be fair to any of us." She turned as Silas and Rosa approached, and he saw something new in her face, a hardness that hadn't been there 3 days ago. The last of her innocence had been stripped away by betrayal, leaving behind someone who looked older and infinitely sadder. "I suppose you've heard," she said without preamble. "Peterson said he was going to inform you of the situation." "Sarah, I'm so sorry," Rosa said, reaching for the young woman's hands. "This must be devastating." "Devastating?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I've spent 2 years wondering why we never seem to have enough money, why Father looked so haggard all the time, why Mother jumped every time someone knocked on the door. I thought it was my fault, somehow, that I was costing them too much. Now I find out they were stealing money and using my wages to pay gambling debts." Her voice broke on the last words, and Silas felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. This was Marcus's daughter, his family, and she'd been hurt by the very people who should have protected her. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. Sarah wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "I don't know. Peterson says I can access some of my inheritance immediately, enough to secure lodging and support myself until the legal matters are settled. I suppose I'll find a room somewhere and continue teaching, at least until the scandal makes that impossible. Or," Silas said carefully, "you could come home with us." "To Texas? To the ranch where your father grew up?" Sarah looked at him with eyes that seemed decades older than they had 3 days ago. "Is this how it works, then? Do I only get to choose my family when my other options have been taken away?" The question stung because it contained too much truth. Silas had wanted Sarah to choose him freely, not because circumstances had forced her hand. But life rarely offered the clean choices people wished for. "No," he said finally. "You get to choose your family based on who wants what's best for you, not what's best for themselves. The Morrisons may have loved you, but they also used you. I'm offering you a place where you belong by right, not by charity." Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, her face pale with shame. "Sarah, please don't judge us too harshly. We did love you. We do love you. But Thomas is right. You'll be better off away from the disgrace we've brought on ourselves." Sarah turned to face the woman who'd raised her, and when she spoke, her voice was filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass 18 years of misplaced loyalty. "I know you loved me, Mother. That's what makes this so much worse. You loved me, but you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. You let me blame myself for problems that weren't my fault, and you let me give you money I thought was helping while you knew it was just feeding Father's gambling." She picked up her carpetbag and looked one last time at the house where she'd grown up. When she turned back to Silas and Rosa, something in her expression had changed, not broken, but hardened into resolve. "I'll come to Texas with you," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I want to know where I came from. I want to understand who my real father was and what kind of people the Boones really are." As they walked away from the Morrison house, Sarah didn't look back. But Silas saw her shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, and he understood that she wasn't just leaving a house, she was leaving behind the only family she'd ever known, along with the last of her illusions about love and trust, and the people who claimed to care for her. The train pulled away from St. Louis on a cold November morning, carrying them back toward Texas and an uncertain future. Sarah sat by the window in their private car, watching the city disappear behind them with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. She'd spoken little since leaving the Morrison house, maintaining a polite but distant demeanor that reminded Silas painfully of Marcus in one of his stubborn moods. Rosa had arranged their seating to give Sarah space while still providing gentle companionship. She worked on her needlepoint while keeping a maternal eye on the young woman who'd had her entire world restructured in the span of a week. Silas found himself stealing glances at his niece, searching for signs of what she might be thinking or feeling. As the Missouri landscape rolled past, Sarah finally broke her silence. "Tell me about him," she said without looking away from the window. "Tell me about my father when you were children." Silas set aside the newspaper he'd been pretending to read. "Marcus was 3 years older than me, and he never let me forget it. He was always the responsible one, the one our father looked to for leadership. Even as boys, he had this sense of duty that made him take everything seriously." "What did he look like?" "Like you, actually. Same green eyes, same stubborn chin. He was taller than me by a few inches, broader in the shoulders, the kind of man who looked like he could handle whatever came his way." Sarah touched her reflection in the train window. "The Morrisons always said I didn't look like my mother. They had a photograph of her. She was small and dark-haired, very delicate-looking. I used to wonder where I got my height and my coloring." "You got those from the Boones," Rosa said warmly. "Your grandfather was a tall man too, and your grandmother had hair the color of wheat in sunlight. You would have fit right in with the family photographs." "What about his personality? What was he like as a person?" Silas considered how to answer honestly without painting Marcus as a saint. He was principled to a fault, sometimes so concerned with doing the right thing that he forgot to consider how his choices affected the people around him. He could be stubborn and self-righteous, but he was also the most loyal person I ever knew. When Marcus cared about something or someone, he cared completely. "Is that why you fought before the war? Because he was principled and you weren't?" The question hit closer to home than Silas was comfortable with. "We fought because we were both young and proud and convinced we knew better than the other. Marcus thought going to war was a duty he owed to something larger than himself. I thought it was a waste of good men's lives for politicians' quarrels. Who was right? Maybe we both were, maybe neither of us was. The war happened whether we agreed with it or not, and good men died on both sides. Marcus died believing he was serving a cause worth dying for. I survived believing the cause wasn't worth my brother's life." Sarah fell silent again, processing this information. Outside the window, the landscape was changing from Missouri farmland to Arkansas hills, each mile taking them further from everything she'd known and closer to a legacy she wasn't sure she wanted to claim. That evening, as they shared dinner in the dining car, Sarah surprised them both with a direct question. "What will people in Texas think of me? A girl raised by strangers, showing up to claim an inheritance?" "They'll think you're Marcus Boone's daughter," Silas said firmly. "That's all they need to know. But what if I'm not good enough? What if I don't know how to be the kind of person a Boone should be?" Rosa reached across the table to pat Sarah's hand. "Mija, you're already exactly the kind of person a Boone should be. You're independent, you work hard, you care about other people. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become." "But I don't know anything about ranching or cattle or business. I'm a school teacher from Missouri. What am I going to do with thousands of acres and silver mines?" "You'll learn," Silas said, "and you don't have to do it alone. I've been running the ranch for 15 years. I can teach you everything you need to know. Or, if you decide ranch life isn't for you, we can hire managers to handle the business while you do whatever makes you happy." Sarah studied his face across the table. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't really know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible person." Because you're family, Silas said simply, and because I made a promise to Marcus, even if I didn't know I was making it at the time. What promise? When we were boys, before the anger and the pride got in the way, we promised each other that we'd always look out for family, that Boones would stick together no matter what. I failed at that promise once. I won't fail again. The next day brought them into Texas, and Sarah pressed her face to the window as the landscape opened up into vast plains dotted with cattle and marked by endless sky. Her eyes widened at the sheer scope of the country, so different from the neat, contained world of St. Louis. "It's enormous," she breathed. "How does anyone find their way in all this space?" "You follow the landmarks," Silas explained. "That mesa in the distance, the bend in the creek, the way the hills roll. After a while, the land speaks to you. Does it speak to everyone, or just to people who belong here?" It was a loaded question, and they all knew it. Sarah was asking whether this place would ever feel like home to her, whether the blood in her veins would recognize the soil her father had loved. "I think it speaks to anyone willing to listen," Rosa said gently. "But some people hear it louder than others." As they neared the final stretch of their journey, Silas found himself growing nervous about Sarah's first impression of the ranch. He'd built something impressive, but would it feel like home to a young woman who'd grown up in the structured comfort of city life? "Sarah," he said, as the train began to slow for their final stop, "I want you to know that you don't have to decide anything right away. The ranch is big enough for both of us, and if you decide you want to go back to teaching or pursue something else entirely, we'll figure out how to make that work." She turned from the window to look at him, and for the first time since leaving St. Louis, her expression held something approaching warmth. "You're nervous," she said with surprise. "You're actually nervous about whether I'll like your ranch." "It's not just my ranch," Silas said. "It was Marcus's too before the war took him away, and now it's yours as much as mine. I suppose I want you to love it the way he did, the way I do. And if I don't—" Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching the familiar landscape roll past outside. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life trying to help you find something you do love. That's what family does." Sarah smiled, really smiled for the first time since they'd met. "I think I'm beginning to understand why my father missed you, even after your fight. You're stubborn and sentimental and completely determined to do right by people, even when they haven't given you much reason to try." "That sounds like a boon to me," Rosa laughed. As the train pulled into the station and they gathered their belongings for the final stage of their journey, Sarah reached into her carpet bag and pulled out the silver pocket watch Silas had given her to hold. She'd been carrying it since St. Louis, and now she held it out to him. "I think this should stay with you until I prove I deserve to carry it," she said. Silas shook his head. "It was always meant to be yours, Sarah. Marcus left it behind because he was angry, but he would have wanted you to have it. Besides," he smiled, "I have a feeling you're going to prove yourself sooner than you think." As the train whistle blew and they stepped onto the platform that would take them home, Silas felt something shift in his chest. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't traveling toward an empty house. He was bringing family home where family belonged, and despite all the uncertainties ahead, that felt like the beginning of something beautiful. The wagon ride from the train station to the ranch stretched for 2 hours through country that seemed to expand forever in every direction. Sarah sat between Silas and Rosa, her eyes wide as she took in the vast scale of the landscape that would now be part of her heritage. Cattle dotted the horizon like scattered coins, and the sky stretched overhead in a dome of blue that dwarfed anything she'd ever seen in Missouri. "That's the boundary marker for Boone land," Silas said, pointing to a weathered wooden post topped with a brand burned deep into the wood. "From here to those hills in the distance, and north to the creek that runs behind the house. All of it?" Sarah's voice carried a note of disbelief. "That's more land than some entire counties back east. Your father and I started with 500 acres that our father left us." We built the rest through hard work and some lucky strikes in the silver mines. Marcus always said land was the only thing that lasted, the only thing worth passing down to the next generation. As they crested a low hill, the ranch house came into view, and Sarah drew in a sharp breath. The sprawling two-story structure sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, its wrap-around porches and multiple chimneys speaking of comfort and permanence. Outbuildings dotted the immediate area: stables, barns, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, and corrals where horses moved in lazy circles. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered. "It looks like something from a storybook." "It looks like home," Rosa said with satisfaction. "And look who's waiting for us." Jake Morrison stood on the front porch, his hat in his hands and a smile creasing his weathered face. Behind him, several ranch hands had gathered, curious to see the boss's niece, who'd been the subject of much speculation during Silas's absence. As the wagon rolled to a stop, Jake stepped forward to help Rosa down while Silas assisted Sarah. The young woman stood in the dusty yard, looking up at the house that represented everything she'd never known she'd lost. "Miss Sarah," Jake said, removing his hat completely. "Welcome to the Boone Ranch. Your uncle's talked about nothing but you for weeks." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Sarah's voice was steady, but Silas could see her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her traveling dress. "It's all quite overwhelming." "That's normal," Jake assured her. "This country takes some getting used to, especially for folks from back east. But you've got good people here to help you settle in." Ember approached the fence of the nearby corral, nickering softly, as if she recognized something familiar about the newcomer. Sarah turned toward the sound, and her eyes widened as she saw the chestnut mare. "Is that the horse?" she asked Silas. "The one that led you to the cave?" "Mantum, Narscom. Mantum, Narscom. That's Ember. She's got a sense about things, that one. Seems like she approves of you." Sarah walked slowly toward the fence, extending her hand toward Ember's nose. The mare sniffed delicately, then nuzzled Sarah's palm with gentle acceptance. Something in Sarah's expression shifted as she touched the horse that had been instrumental in bringing her home. "She's beautiful," Sarah murmured. "Did my father know her?" "He helped train her when she was a filly," Silas said, joining Sarah at the fence. "Marcus always said horses could judge character better than most people. If Ember likes you, that's a good sign." They were interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching fast, dust clouds marking its urgent passage across the plain. Silas frowned as he recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Sheriff Tom Bradley, and the lawman's presence rarely meant good news. Bradley pulled up in the yard and climbed down from his wagon with the stiff movements of a man who'd ridden hard. His face was grim as he approached, touching his hat brim in greeting to the ladies. "Silas, glad you're back. We've got trouble brewing, and it concerns your family." Sarah stiffened beside him. "What kind of trouble?" Bradley glanced at her with curiosity before addressing Silas. "Word's gotten around about Miss Sarah here, about her inheritance and her connection to the ranch. There's been some men asking questions in town, strangers from back east. They've been making inquiries about the legality of the inheritance, whether a girl raised by strangers has any real claim to Boone property." Silas felt his jaw clench. "What kind of men?" "The kind that carry legal papers and talk about contesting wills. They've been staying at the hotel in town for 3 days, asking pointed questions about family lineage and inheritance law. From what I can tell, they're representing some party that has an interest in seeing Miss Sarah's claim challenged." "But that's impossible," Sarah said, her voice rising with alarm. "Peterson handled all the legal matters. He said the inheritance was clear and uncontested." Bradley's expression was apologetic, but firm. "Ma'am, I'm sure Mr. Peterson did his best, but these fellows seem to think they've found some angle to work. They're planning to serve papers tomorrow, something about improper documentation and questionable family connections." The happiness of homecoming evaporated like morning dew. Sarah had just begun to believe she might belong somewhere, might finally have found the family and heritage she'd always yearned for. Now it seemed even that was going to be taken away from her. The confrontation came sooner than expected. The next morning, as Sarah was sharing breakfast with Silas and Rosa on the front porch, a carriage approached, bearing 3 men in expensive suits. The lead figure was tall and thin, with silver hair and calculating eyes that swept over the ranch with obvious appraisal. "Mr. Boone," the man called out as he climbed down from the carriage. "I'm Jonathan Aldrich, attorney from Chicago. I represent certain interested parties concerning the estate of Marcus Boone." Silas stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Sarah's shoulder. "What interested parties would those be?" Aldrich smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My clients prefer to remain anonymous for now. However, they have compelling evidence that the young woman claiming to be Marcus Boone's daughter has no legal right to the inheritance in question." Sarah rose from her chair, her chin lifting in a gesture that reminded Silas powerfully of Marcus facing down a challenge. "I am Marcus Boone's daughter. I have his letter acknowledging me and legal documentation establishing my parentage." "Ah, yes, the letter," Aldrich said, producing a leather portfolio from his carriage. "We've had experts examine copies of that document, and there are serious questions about its authenticity. The handwriting analysis suggests it may have been forged, possibly by someone with access to samples of Marcus Boone's writing." "That's impossible," Rosa interjected, standing to flank Sarah's other side. "We found that letter hidden in a cave where only family would know to look. Or, one of Aldrich's companions suggested, where someone wanting to create the appearance of legitimacy might place a carefully crafted forgery." Silas felt his temper rising, but he kept his voice level. Aldrich opened his portfolio and spread several papers on the porch table. Handwriting analysis from 3 separate experts, all of whom identify inconsistencies in letter formation and ink composition. More importantly, we have testimony from surviving members of Marcus Boone's unit that he never mentioned having a wife or child. "Men don't always talk about their private affairs to fellow soldiers," Sarah said, but Silas could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Perhaps not," Aldrich conceded, "but they do tend to mention such things in their letters home. We've located and examined Marcus Boone's military correspondence with friends and distant relatives. No mention of Elizabeth Hartwell or a daughter named Sarah. The systematic nature of their attack was becoming clear. These men had done their research, building a case designed to cast doubt on every piece of evidence supporting Sarah's claim. Silas realized they were dealing with professional fortune hunters, people who made their living by challenging inheritances and taking a percentage of whatever they could claim. "Even if that were true," Silas said, "Sarah is still my brother's daughter. I've seen the resemblance with my own eyes." "Physical resemblance proves nothing in a court of law," Aldrich replied smoothly. "Many people share similar features without being related. Without proper documentation, birth certificates, marriage records, baptismal records, there's no legal basis for inheritance claims." "We have Peterson's documentation," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Peterson is a well-meaning gentleman, but he relied on the word of the Morrison family, who themselves relied on the word of a dying woman. Hearsay built upon hearsay does not constitute legal proof." Silas watched Sarah's face as the lawyers systematically destroyed each pillar of evidence supporting her claim. She was trying to remain strong, but he could see doubt beginning to creep in. These men were experts at sowing uncertainty, at making people question what they knew to be true. "What exactly are you proposing?" Silas asked. "My clients are prepared to settle this matter quietly and generously," Aldrich said. "Miss Hartwell, for that is her legal name, would receive a payment of $5,000 in exchange for renouncing any claim to the Marcus Boone estate. It's more than fair compensation for any inconvenience she may have suffered." $5,000, Sarah repeated quietly. "For an inheritance worth $60,000? "For an inheritance she has no legal right to claim," Aldrich corrected. $5,000 is a generous offer for someone with no legitimate claim." The insult of it struck Silas like a physical blow. These scavengers were trying to steal Sarah's inheritance by making her doubt her own identity, her own worth, her own right to exist as a Boone. "Get off my land," Silas said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Jake step closer from where he'd been watching by the stables. "Mr. Boone, be reasonable. This matter will inevitably end up in court, where Miss Hartwell's claim will be thoroughly examined by hostile attorneys. The publicity alone could be devastating for a young woman's reputation. We're offering her a graceful way out." "I said, get off my land." Silas stepped down from the porch, his presence suddenly menacing despite his lack of weapons. "Before I forget my manners entirely." Aldrich gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. "We'll be in town for 3 more days, should you wish to reconsider. After that, we'll file formal challenges to the inheritance in federal court." As their carriage rolled away, Sarah sank back into her chair, her face pale with shock and uncertainty. The family she'd just found, the heritage she'd just begun to claim, was being threatened by men who saw nothing but dollar signs where she saw belonging and love. The battle for Sarah's inheritance was won not in a courtroom, but in the dusty archives of a small church in Amarillo. Rosa had remembered something from Marcus's letter, a mention of his secret marriage to Elizabeth Hartwell. If such a marriage had taken place, there would be records, and those records would establish Sarah's legitimacy beyond any legal challenge. It took 2 days of searching through baptismal records, marriage certificates, and burial documents before they found what they needed. The marriage certificate was dated 3 months before Marcus left for war, signed by both Marcus Boone and Elizabeth Hartwell, witnessed by the church pastor, and recorded in the official registry. More importantly, they found Sarah's birth certificate, filed under Sarah Elizabeth Boone, clearly identifying Marcus as her father and establishing her legal right to the family name she'd never known was hers. When Aldrich and his associates were presented with the documented proof, their carefully constructed case collapsed like a house of cards. Within hours, they were gone from the territory, moving on to easier prey and less well-documented challenges. But the real victory came that evening, as Sarah stood in the parlor of the ranch house, holding the silver pocket watch that had finally come home to her. Silas had insisted on a proper ceremony, with Rosa and Jake as witnesses, as he formally presented her with her inheritance, not just the money and land, but the family history that made it all meaningful. "This watch has carried the names of Boone men for 3 generations, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your grandfather carried it, your father carried it, and now it belongs to you, the next generation of the family." Sarah opened the watch and read the inscription aloud. "Marcus and Silas Boone, brothers always." She looked up at her uncle with tears in her green eyes. "It should say Marcus and Silas and Sarah Boone, family always." "Maybe someday it will," Silas said softly. "When you have children of your own to pass it down to." The months that followed brought changes to the Boone Ranch that no one could have predicted. Sarah proved to have a natural talent for the business side of ranching, working with Peterson to establish new trading relationships and expand their silver mining operations. She also insisted on building a school for the children of ranch hands and neighboring families, fulfilling her calling as a teacher while serving her new community. Rosa watched with maternal satisfaction as Sarah blossomed in the Texas sunshine, her city pallor replaced by a healthy glow that spoke of belonging and purpose. The young woman who'd arrived uncertain and displaced had grown into someone who commanded respect from seasoned cowboys and silver miners alike. One evening, as autumn painted the plains in shades of gold and crimson, Silas found Sarah sitting on the front porch where he'd spent so many lonely nights over the years. She was reading a letter, and her expression was thoughtful rather than sad. "News from St. Louis?" he asked, settling into the rocking chair that had become his customary spot. "From Mrs. Morrison," Sarah replied, folding the letter carefully. "Mr. Morrison avoided prison, but they've lost the house." They're moving to live with her sister in Kansas, starting over with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Silas studied his niece's profile, noting the maturity that had settled into her features over the past year. How does that make you feel? Sad for them, but not guilty anymore. I spent so long thinking their problems were somehow my fault, that my presence in their lives had caused their troubles. Now I understand that people make their own choices, and sometimes those choices have consequences that hurt innocent people. That's wisdom that took me 40 years to learn. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face with warmth that reminded Silas of Marcus at his best. I had a good teacher. Uncle, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think my father would be proud of what we've built here? The school, the expansion, the way we've made the ranch a place where families can grow. Silas looked out over the land that had been his refuge and was now their shared legacy. Lights glowed in the windows of the workers' cottages, and he could hear children laughing as they played in the gathering dusk. The lonely empire he'd built as a monument to guilt had been transformed into something living and purposeful. I think Marcus would be amazed, he said finally. He always believed in the importance of family and community, but he never got the chance to build what you've built here. You've taken his dream and made it bigger and better than he ever imagined. Sarah reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the simple gesture carrying more meaning than any words could express. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, two people who'd found each other across the vast spaces of loss and time. Ember nickered softly from the corral, as if offering her approval of the peace that had finally settled over the Boone ranch. The horse that had led them to the truth now grazed contentedly, her work complete. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the plains, carrying other travelers toward their own destinations and destinies. But Silas and Sarah were exactly where they belonged, home, finally and forever, with family and purpose and the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something that will outlast any single lifetime. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily in Sarah's palm, marking time that would never be lost again, carrying forward the names and dreams of people who understood that the greatest inheritance isn't money or land, but the unbreakable bonds that make strangers into family and houses into homes. Sometimes the things we regret most are the family we never got to know. But sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we get a second chance to make those connections, to bridge the gaps that pride and circumstance created, and to discover that love really can conquer the spaces between hearts that always belonged together.